Hello, everyone. Welcome to the BioWaves podcast, the project of four college students united through friendship and a shared passion for investigating today's most innovative neurological advancements from diverse perspectives. I'm Ferris, a second year at UC Berkeley majoring in molecular and cellular biology. I'm an aspiring pre-medical student that hopes to treat people across the world in organizations like UNICEF and Doctors Without Borders.
I'm Shravan, a sophomore at UC Berkeley intending to major in molecular and cellular biology and neuroscience, with research interests in neurological disorders and neurosurgery, and a passion for finding new treatments for rare genetic and neurological disorders.
I'm Ibrahim, a second year at UC Berkeley intending to major in molecular and cellular biology with an emphasis in immunology. I want to make a genuine impact on addressing the impacts of diabetes, especially those in underserved communities.
I'm Jude, a sophomore at UC Berkeley intending to major in molecular and cellular biology and to minor in data science. I have a passion for using technology to promote the human good.
Before we begin today's episode, I just wanted to say that the views expressed in this podcast are solely based on our personal opinions and speculations. The discussions regarding legal matters are not intended to constitute legal advice and should not be relied upon as much. Now, past that disclaimer, without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
So the first topic I wanted to discuss with you guys was this remarkable study spearheaded by Cristina Denisova of CUNY that looked into the connection between sensory motor variation and autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. I think we all have some idea, maybe not a very formal one, but some idea nonetheless of what ASD is. What is sensory motor variation, though?
Essentially, it's what the name sounds like, variation, that is, differences in our motor functions. Sensory motor variability is an ingrained fact of human life. Our actions, whatever they may be, are nearly guaranteed to be different. Diwali et al., another study cited by Denisionova, cites the piano as an example. Regardless of how much the pianist practices, the chances of him generating two identical performances at any point are basically just zero.
But why is this the case? I mean, what physically would prevent someone from performing the same movement twice?
I guess while it technically is possible, it's technically possible, but practically it's impossible. The reason for this is that at a very basic level, the nervous system operates by very imprecise mechanisms, things like ion channels, synapses, and neurons, and even at a very high level, instabilities in neural networks. All of these processes inherently have some randomness to them. And since larger processes like sensation and motion are composed of these more fundamental ones, variability is in a sense baked in.
Fair enough, but why are these variations, even if they're sizable, so bad?
In one respect, variability is not all negative. Again, returning to Diwali, they compare motor variability to genetic variations, which are necessary for evolution. They make the assertion that greater exploration of the motor space helps infants develop higher performance and even more efficient behaviors. The idea being they try a lot of like different variations of movements before finally perfecting one. Nonetheless, this analogy to genetic variation cuts the other way as well. Just as dramatic genetic mutations are almost always a negative, dramatic sensory motor variability harms a child and hinders their development. This new study seeks to further analyze these negatives, specifically their use as a marker of low IQ in autism spectrum disorder, ASD again. Infants pre-diagnosis. By selecting infants at high risk for ASD, typically because they have an older sibling with ASD, and comparing their sensory motor features to infants from a neurotypical control group, Denisinova was able to establish a statistically significant relationship between atypical sensory motor features, both during sleep and wakefulness, and low IQ ASD. Interestingly, infants with an average or above average IQ ASD could not be differentiated from the neurotypical control by their sensory motor features alone.
I see, that's pretty interesting. But I feel like you have hit on the chicken or egg question. Is it that lower IQ affords ASD infants less control over sensory motor variability? Or is it that atypical sensory motor variability is a contributing factor to low IQ ASD?
Well, the study takes the position that, and I'm quoting directly now, These motor systems characteristics are neurobiological precursors of how our brains map motor and cognitive experiences for successful learning. So, per this view, essentially it's excessive sensory motor variability that inhibits future learning, and that's what contributes to lower IQ. So, learning as per the reinforcement learning framework occurs as the learner explores potential actions, discovering their consequences, and from there selecting those actions with the most positive consequences. Excessive sensory motor variability cuts this process out at the selection. Poor coordination of movement prevents the learner from semi-consistently choosing actions with the most desirous consequences, preventing the fundamental association between desired actions to be learned, and the rewards that make them desirous, and thus hindering future learning.
What are some practical implications of these findings?
So the study focuses especially on how these findings can be put into practice in the real world. By dividing children with ASD into two broad categories, those with expected high IQ and those with expected lower IQ, the researchers are enabled to make much more directed recommendations for interventions. Specifically, the study states that for children with expected higher IQ, and again I'm quoting now, the focus could be on leveraging their strengths to recognize and mitigate downstream mental health consequences of compensation or camouflaging. So it's clear that for these children who are expected to have a higher IQ, the focus should be more on emotional and social interventions, helping them to develop skills like regulating their feelings or sublimating difficult emotions instead of seeking more destructive emotional outlets. There should also be a substantial component to help them develop appropriate social competencies and such and such. But as for children with expected lower IQ, the focus should instead be on, and again I'm quoting, interventions for lower IQ autistic children may differ in focus, improving both sensory, motor, and cognitive skills, but not either one alone. The dual focus, as the researchers assert, will be more productive and efficacious than a single concentrated one.
Oh, so what are some future questions that remain to be answered?
So one of the major questions that I feel the researchers developed, but I don't think they've really fully answered this, or rather, a better way of saying this is that it could be further answered in a more diverse context, is the correlation between motor and cognitive skills. So in their discussion, the authors they present the standard like reinforcement learning framework. So motor skills, in their view, motor skills are a necessary precursor to cognitive ones. Specifically, learning. Learning takes place in a motor context, and it's a crucial component that's going to be needed for a robust cognitive, or for lack of a better word, booky type of learning. So I feel like this theoretical framework could be further developed in a more educational context to better understand learning as a full body activity. There's always been an interest in the idea of a mind body connection as it pertains to education, and I feel that further work in these adjacent topics could better elucidate the connection beyond the obvious facets of sleep, exercise, etc., making you like better or worse in school. So concretely understanding this type of link could have like major consequences for education.
Interesting. I see. So I think through a lot of these studies, we're starting to see kind of this distinction between high IQ and low IQ. It seems to be emphasized in a lot of these studies, which sort of presents this idea of a binary. But I think to most people, as it's called, ASD is like a spectrum. People kind of see the nature of autism as a spectrum. So what do these studies maybe imply about the nature of autism?
Yeah, you've hit on a pretty like big point. So again, like as you were saying, the current literature it really stresses the idea of autism as occurring on a spectrum. And so this like binary distinction that the researchers are making in their study between like higher IQ and lower IQ ASD, uh it could end up being more than just a convenient method to like focus interventions. I mean, as we gain a further understanding of ASD, I'm sure that our understanding of the features, patterns, and manifestations of the condition will also further develop. There's nothing explicitly in the study that seems to challenge the idea of autism as occurring on a spectrum, or or there's nothing in the study that could not be explained in terms of just like a distillation of the spectrum idea. But this is like one of the many wrinkles in like the condition that perhaps either further work will just like smooth that out, iron it out, or perhaps they'll use this as a basis for, who knows, maybe an even more sophisticated schematization of the condition.
Interesting. So I'd say aside sort of on the methods that they use to quantify these abnormal movements, regardless, it is very fascinating the kind of technology the researchers used to specifically quantify abnormal movements in general. They used fMRIs, quoting from the study directly, because head movements affect the acquired blood oxygenation level dependence, which, is abbreviated as BOLD, signal. During analyses, researchers routinely edited out BOLD data time points showing heightened head movements. And as for these studies, head movements are a nuisance and considered a random occurrence during an MRI scan session. Of course, for these studies, these head movements were the very data points being collected, and the precision that they could be collected at and mathematically analyzed is just incredible. MRI technology has evolved tremendously since its inception, and new innovations such as the 7 Tesla MRI offer ultra high resolution images, enabling doctors to detect even the smallest abnormalities in the brain, such as lesions and microinfarctions. It's going to be useful for diagnosing neurological conditions like epilepsy and early stage Alzheimer's. This can especially be useful towards potentially slowing down a person's Alzheimer's progression.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. So you mentioned Alzheimer's. Are there any other like, or what specifically, what medical conditions could this be useful for?
Well, it's set to provide a better way to diagnose neurological conditions. So yeah, like epilepsy, early stage Alzheimer's, and yeah, like the earlier that we detect Alzheimer's, the better prognosis for the patient that's going to be.
So based on this, I can really see like how the technology is pretty useful overall. So I just wanted to know what are some other innovations that we have found in terms of the detection field?
Yeah, well, now we see that portable MR systems, which are lower field machines that can work in remote locations or emergency settings, and they allow for real time brain imaging without the need for a full on hospital setup. The main company producing these is called Hyperfine.
I can really see how these would be important in addressing health issues, especially in rural and poor regions where there's a lack of medical supply, and the care in these areas is not great.
Yeah, which also I'm assuming means that the problem with this technology is going to be how accessible it's going to be for all areas, including urban, rural, and remote areas.
Oh yeah, so that's pretty much like the problem with the systems is that these portable MR systems tend to be expensive, so it's likely going to make a minimal impact for now.
But I mean, I don't think you should be so negative or dismissive. I mean, minimal impact is still it's still an impact nonetheless. Maybe in the future, as these become more affordable and more widespread, so that maybe like more people in like or I guess underserved and rural areas can be like included in these like great healthcare advancements.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe later on these could be like mass produced, although their production is not more complex than your typical factory work. There is one more kind of innovation that I found interesting regarding abnormal movements. We see that there's a more substantial mix of wearable sensors and AI driven analysis.
So wearable sensors and AI-driven analysis is pretty interesting, considering we see that on many of the technology that you wear, such as the Apple Watch. But what kind of MRI systems would wearable sensors and AI be useful for?
Yeah, so we're mainly focused on fMRI here, where this mix can give us a more precise understanding of movements disorders in patients like Parkinson's disease.
So, based on my understanding, I think there's also going to be a machine learning component to this, not just AI and sensors, right?
Yeah, exactly. The devices can track minute changes in a person's gait or hand tremors and feed data into a machine learning algorithm to predict how these conditions might progress. So the newest thing about this is using and AI, which can really help with results and just analyzing the results for a better, um, a better prognosis.
Okay. Very nicely explained, Ibrahim. Pivoting back to the biomarkers for autism spectrum disorder, what are some other biomarkers that contribute to ASD in children?
Yeah, so another class of biomarkers that could contribute to ASD in children is metabolic biomarkers. So this was seen in a study conducted by researchers at UCSD and UC Davis Mind Institute, where they used classical metabolomic and new metabolic network methods to analyze the developmental features of ASD between two groups of people, newborns and 5-year-old children. The researchers aim to identify metabolic biomarkers that could predict the onset of ASD and understand the underlying biochemical pathways involved.
This is really interesting. I know like the first article we focused on looked at like behavioral markers for ASD. But could you like elaborate more on these like biological like I guess physical metabolomic and new metabolic pathways part?
Yeah, sure. So metabolomics is the study of small molecules, known as metabolites, within cells, tissues, or organisms. These metabolites are the end products of cellular processes and can provide valuable insights into the physiological state of an organism. In this study, the researchers analyzed 205 newborns and 53 5-year-old children, some of whom were diagnosed with ASD.
Yeah, that's really cool. But I was wondering, what are some key findings of the study, and how did they actually manage to collect data from 5-year-old children?
Yeah, so I'll be mentioning some key findings here and maybe some key findings later on. But like some of the key findings in the study was that 80% of the metabolic impact in ASD was caused by 14 shared biochemical pathways. And these pathways led to a decreased anti-inflammatory and antioxidant defense, as well as increased levels of physiologic stress molecules like lactate, cholesterol, and ceramides. This suggests that children with ASD experience higher levels of physiological stress and inflammation from an early age. In terms of data collection, researchers used circus plots. So circus plots are basically circular plots that are used to plot like the genetic variation within an individual, as well as a new metabolic network parameter called VNet, which is the measure of metabolic rate, to reveal differences in both the kind and degree of network connectivity. Of the 50 biochemical pathways and 450 polar and lipid metabolites examined, the developmental regulation of the purine network was most significantly altered. In typically developing children, the purine network showed a 17-fold reversal, which did not occur in children with ASD.
I mean I see from the data some significance, but like why specifically is this purine network so important for the study?
Yeah, so the purine network reversal is particularly interesting because it highlights a previously unknown metabolic phenotype in children with ASD. The study also underscores the role of mitochondrial functional changes, purine metabolism, and purinergic signaling in the development of ASD, opening up new avenues for early detection and intervention strategies.
So I'm a little confused by the terminology here. What are you referring to when you are talking about purines?
So, to understand the importance of the purine network reversal, let's delve into the purine metabolism and its role in cellular function. Purines are essential molecules that play a critical role in energy transfer, signal transduction, and the synthesis of nucleic acids. The purine metabolic pathway involves the synthesis and degradation of purine nucleotides, which are vital for DNA and RNA production. In children with ASD, the disruption of this pathway could lead to impaired cellular function and contribute to the development of ASD symptoms.
Okay, yeah, it's a very like, it's an abundance of interesting information, and it seems very detailed, especially in cellular function, but just to make this a little bit easier to understand, why do you think this is all particularly important to ASD symptoms?
Yeah, so in this study, I've so far highlighted the importance of many things, such as mitochondrial function. So mitochondria, as we know, are the powerhouses of the cell, responsible for producing energy through oxidative phosphorylation. The researchers in the study found out that children with ASD had altered mitochondrial function, which could lead to decreased energy production and increased oxidative stress. This could also contribute to the physiological stress and inflammation observed in children with ASD. Another significant point was the increased levels of ceramides in children with ASD. So, ceramides are a type of lipid molecule that play a crucial role in cell membrane structure and signaling. Elevated ceramide levels have been associated with inflammation and cell death, suggesting that children with ASD may experience higher levels of cellular stress and damage. Lastly, I would also say amino acid metabolism is also affected in ASD because amino acids are the building blocks of proteins and they play a vital role in various metabolic processes. The researchers found out that children with ASD had altered levels of several amino acids, including glutamate, glycine, and serine. These changes could impact neurotransmitter function and contribute to the neurological symptoms of ASD.
I guess this sort of like ties us back to the first article we went over. The researchers in that they sort of ended by discussing like how their findings could affect like future treatments. So how do you think, or future like intervention is probably a better word. So how do you think the findings of this study may apply to future treatments, I guess, or interventions of ASD?
Yeah, so based on what I read, I believe that the findings in the study may have important implications for early detection and treatment of ASD. So, by studying metabolic biomarkers and understanding the biochemical pathways behind it, researchers could develop targeted therapies and interventions, such as cell and gene therapies, to address the underlying metabolic imbalances in children with ASD. In addition to that, early diagnosis and intervention could significantly improve the quality of life for these children as well as their families.
Well, that wraps up our very first episode. Thank you so much for listening, and if you didn't skip forward, for staying until the end. For most of us, it's our first time ever producing a podcast, so we would appreciate any comments, suggestions, or critiques, or anything at all. Feel free to email us at biowavesberkeley@gmail.com or at any of our streaming and social media platforms.
Also, if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to our podcast, whether you are listening on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, we're on all those platforms. If you guys have any other suggestions, we can get on. We upload bi-weekly episodes so that when you're subscribed, you never miss an upload. And until then, take it easy. Also, if you guys would like a link to the article we've referenced, we'll provide that under our podcast. Thank you.